Herzlich willkommen. Mein Name ist Eleanor Taylor und ich bin eine Assistentin in der Dramaturgie der Kunsthalle Wien. Heute ist der dritte und letzte Tag von unserem Symposium zum Thema Entfremdung. So, as I just mentioned auf Deutsch, I'm Eleanor and today is the third and final day of the symposium. The presentations and panel discussions closing the event today will be in English, and I'm happy to see so many familiar faces from the past few days here again. And to those of you who've just joined us today, a warm welcome to Antarctica, a cold, bleak and distant image suggestively presented to approach a rather cold-hearted phenomenon, alienation. This symposium is actually serving as a sort of prologue to the exhibition Antarctica, which will open on the 24th of October, to which you're all also warmly invited. I'm thrilled to introduce three very inspiring guest speakers today who've traveled to be here. Marina Vishmidt, who's based in London and teaching at Goldsmiths. Kerstin Stackelmeier, based in Berlin and teaching at Fine Arts Academy in Nuremberg, and Angela Dimitrakaki, who's based between Edinburgh and Athens and who's teaching at University of Edinburgh. So today's lectures fall under the admittedly rather ambiguous subtitle, Beyond Alienation. Can we envision existence beyond alienation? One of the crucial perspectives we hope to be addressed during this symposium, to quote the introductory concept which is in the booklet, draws from this observation of social coldness, and undoubtedly a discussion of heated or lukewarm efforts to both understand and overcome this, is, if it's even deemed possible, have already been explored. And just so to provide you with a brief recap before launching this evening's presentations, I'll just cover. So Nina Power's lecture asked, who is the subject of alienation? She traced key stages in the genealogy of the concept of alienation, and on the basis of Marxist concept of the Gattung, she focused on the ethical, political difficulties that come with essentializing statements of alienation critique. Based on the writings of Alexandra Kollontai, she formulated approaches to utopia of non-alienated existence and practice. And yesterday, the philosopher Michael Hirsch elaborated on the historical relation between work and alienation. As a possible perspective beyond alienation, he suggested as a first step to a radical reduction of the average working time towards the minimum, so drawing a line from Marxist critique of wage labor to neo-Marxist theories of Marcuse and Adorno. The second speaker yesterday, Andreas Rumphuber, looked into the spaces of contemporary alienation, the office, and showed how the so-called Bürolandschaft, formerly invented as a means to empower the individual employee, has now become the blueprint for megalomaniac office spaces such as Facebook's headquarters. So alienation is a concept which we can all relate to, and without much further ado, Marina, the floor is yours to unfold the significations of relatable alienation.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, Max, Gerhard, everyone who's made this possible and invited me. Thank you so much. I will stand by the mic. So I don't have any media, unfortunately, but there will be some more after me. So for this presentation, which perhaps some of you will find a bit elementary, I will be departing somewhat from the abstract that was published and instead looking to unfold, as Eleanor already mentioned, some of the implications of the title, Relatable Alienation, though that will probably not exclude some engagement with the themes mentioned in the abstract along the way. So what do I mean by the term relatable alienation? First, we'd need to appreciate the ambiguity of the component term alienation itself in its various contexts and circulations. It's one of those terms that is overpoweringly tempting to use in the formulation of generalities, simply because it contains so many connotations and usages, both vernacular and specialized. To try and map some of these would be an undertaking that this paper couldn't possibly give me the scope for, though perhaps the 3 days of this symposium and the upcoming exhibition have done and will do a great deal towards covering some of that field. So I'll have to adopt some quite crude methods here and work more indexically than genealogically. First, we can say that the significations of alienation are also influenced by their relationship to English or to German language histories of usage. In English, alienation has often had to do with possession and dispossession. Such traditional forms in English are embodied in legal-sounding but metaphorical expressions like the alienation of affection, which is a charge against the third party in a divorce case, for example, or the right to transfer the title to a property from one owner to another is also called alienation, and also known as conveyance, the set of laws and customs pertaining to the circulation of property. So there's this quite technical use of alienation, which perhaps we don't encounter that much anymore outside these somewhat archaic legal realms. The other main use of alienation in English is to refer to a psychological state, which connotes distance or estrangement. To become alienated from your friends is to become distanced from them due to some kind of irresolvable personal, if implicitly social, conflict, like a substance abuse problem or a political disagreement, rather than contingency, like moving to another country or not having internet. So this notion of estrangement then leads us to the German derivations of alienation, which also register in contemporary English uses, and that's the more existential dimension of alienation, one like vis-a-vis, say, Albert Camus' The Stranger and the whole set of attitudes associated with, for example, 1950s existentialism. Alienation, unhomeliness, as the constitutive condition of human existence, something which you also get in the varieties of psychoanalytic theory, informed by Heidegger and the Hegel that has been existentialized by Kojève, such as Lacan's work. With Hegel, of course, you get a whole bunch of associations which are then further taken up and developed by Marx. And this is the principal source of the inflections that the term alienation has gathered as a topic in philosophy and contemporary theory. Alienation is used to translate terms such as Entäußerung, which can mean externalization, and Entfremdung, which is alienation, the everyday, I guess, German usage, which is also more like estrangement. And this conceptual and philological ambiguity is often encountered also in the discourse of theater, aesthetics, and art history, when trying to parse Bertolt Brecht's Verfremdungseffekt or Viktor Shklovsky and the Russian formalist Astranenie, which is often translated as defamiliarization, but really likewise means estrangement, albeit literally in the Russian, rather than in the psychologically infused way that English speakers would tend to read it. So what we can start to see already at this point is that there are lots of different philosophical projects that can be pursued under the banner of alienation, complexified with, in this case, several linguistic registers, with the term being alienated, that is to say, conveyed across and between them. What we can also do at this point is divide these projects, at least hastily, into materialist ones and idealist ones. For the purposes of this demonstration, anything legal or psychological, that is to say, anything which does not explicitly focus on the historical and social context of its concept, of its conditions of enunciation, can go over to the side of the idealist. On the materialist side, preeminently, we find situated Marx and his application of alienation to the conditions of labor under capitalist social relations, under capitalist property relations. Here, alienation is neither the liberty of the object or the distance experienced by a subject, but the condition of people suddenly dispossessed of access to any means of survival and having to look to the market for any prospect of the continuation of their existence. The double freedom of having no customary constraints on the sale of your labor power, and the freedom from any means of subsistence in case you don't succeed in selling it. In liberal political theory, with a nod to Isaiah Berlin, this is freedom to and freedom from, or as he called it, negative and positive liberty. And of course, it's this privative form of freedom from, which is most of interest to the liberal tradition, given that's the one that's most concerned with the protection of accumulation of private property from redistribution. This alienation, encountered in the guise of freedom, the deliberate confusion between freedom and alienation being the bedrock of all liberalism, is perpetuated by the balance of forces in society, namely the state, its police force, and other regulatory punitive institutions such as prisons, but also far more diffuse, fragmented, internalized, and market-generated agencies of incitement, capture, and control. So here it looks like alienation is not psychological, but structural. Still, the stakes of a materialist analysis would be to show how these are not separate levels, but rather defined forms of experience which is itself alienated, insofar as the structural conditions that produce it are inaccessible or appear distorted within it, and certainly appear at a scale and a complexity that seems to place them well beyond individual or collective intervention. Nonetheless, alienation does have a history of being criticized in Marxist scholarship as precisely a non-materialist concept, as a leftover of Marx's debt to young Hegelian and Feuerbachian humanism, since the concept appears to presuppose a trans-historical human subject who pre-exists a structure and may find itself lost, that is, alienated within that structure, but may also regain itself in a revolution or in communism, and thus not be alienated anymore from its human essence. The not belonging to oneself of alienation, the subjugation to alien forces, one could say, which also shows the proximity between the concepts of alienation and heteronomy, for example, the domination by external or hostile laws, is of course rooted in the humanist post-Enlightenment Feuerbach-influenced critique of religion, as the displacement of human agency to imaginary divine powers, which keeps society subjugated and static in a mythic time rather than active subjects in historical time. This is an important point, perhaps less so for the polemics around it that emerged from the work of Louis Althusser and the theory of an epistemological break in Marx's work between his humanist or idealist side and his scientific or materialist side. So less so for those polemics than for the way that it draws our attention to the imperative to bracket the human, which may be an entirely transitive concept in some ways in Marx, so thinking species being or Gattungswesen rather as species becoming, as some have written, but which still allows us to open up what is paradoxically alienated in the formulation of the human in Western thought and post-Enlightenment political philosophy drawn upon by Marx. That is, how the formulation of the human creates its own subhumans, non-humans, and aliens. And though the human is a category and a concept replete with contradiction and plasticity, it cannot be denied that a human essence and the corresponding capacity to be alienated from it has restrictions placed upon it by technologies of race, gender, and coloniality. As a proviso for critical understanding, this is surely as basic as you can get and should constitute a methodological premise rather than a conclusion. But for this paper, the important thing here is that alienation is a certain social relationship, which may take the form of a non-relation, to the basic conditions of one's labor, and by extension, the reproduction of one's life and the lives of non-laboring others. Defined in those terms, alienation is not a human condition that may take different forms depending on the nature of the government or the standard of living or the development of technology in a particular time or place, vaguely known as modernity or whatever. So I'll come back to that. So most of the time, when we speak of alienated labor, however, we speak in a register that mixes the materialist and the idealist, necessarily, as I mentioned, or to transpose it into yet another light, alienation refers to a social ontology of dispossession. That is to say, a lack of control and a lack of freedom at the same time, constraint. Alienation is basically about distance, and it is about constraint. Distance from one's own desires, constrained to follow the desires of another, or constrained to fit into structures established by others, of which you are not the prime beneficiary if you benefit from them at all. Alienation means you don't get to decide on anything. You are held at a distance, you are blocked, you cannot begin to even know what it might mean to have control over your life and this as a consistent form of life, not as a personal issue. It is not constitutive of some abstraction called human nature. It is the bedrock of social relations in a particular form, the form that is dominated by the accumulation of capital and the extraction of value. Over the past several years, on the other hand, there has been a movement in some critical theory to reappropriate and, as it were, rehabilitate alienation as a concept and as a mode of experience. Alienation is taken up as a conceptual device used to leverage subjectivity out of immersion in immediacy and the politics that are deemed to come out of that immersion. Politics such as horizontality, politics defined through terms such as horizontality, identity, localism, micropolitics, essentially, or what accelerationist writers called folk politics. Rather than an ethics of the rooted and the particular, in this view, always coded as conservative, whether ostensibly on the left or the right, according to this view, we need a macropolitics of large-scale social planning, the valorization of technoscience, and basically the key separation of the human from nature, which allows it to reshape nature for its own social ends, social and historical ends. So the lackluster witticism I'm going to venture here would be that this is a species being plus robots, but it's a bit more complicated, perhaps. What formations such as accelerationism, Prometheanism, and xenofeminism, and I will provide a few relevant quotes in a second, want the concept of alienation to do for them is to help them wage a battle against a projected set of antagonists on the left, whether in activism or academia, who have deconstructed so much of the universe that they have lost all faith in the betterment of the human condition, which is to say they have ostensibly given up all political horizons beyond sabotage and withdrawal. Alienation is thus intended as a weapon against this perceived insularity, as a way to mark the distance between the potentialities and actualities of social existence today. And most of all, the potentialities of mediating forms, like states and parties, to coordinate particular struggles into irresistible large-scale engines and institutions of social transformation. Alienation in this program is the source of universalism, the key to humanity seizing its ontological destiny to modify human and other than human nature. I've also recently learned that Prometheanism is a label shared with enthusiasts of geoengineering. It's a little bit weird because clearly the object of political desire here is mediation and a rejection of immediacy in the quest for collective self-determination. Yet it's alienation, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with self-determination, which gets mobilized as a positive term in these discourses. So just one of a few category errors we can look at here. Some others are also the pre-critical or pre-feminist critical use of simple abstractions like science and nature. The subtitle of the Manifesto for Xenofeminism is A Politics for Alienation. There we read almost from the beginning that xenofeminism seizes alienation as an impetus to generate new worlds. We are all alienated, but have we ever been otherwise? It is through, and not despite our alienated condition, that we can free ourselves from the muck of immediacy. Freedom is not a given, and it's certainly not given by anything natural, in scare quotes, natural. The construction of freedom involves not less but more alienation. Alienation is the labor of freedom's construction, end quote. Okay, so what's clear here is that alienation is a kind of Baron Munchausen style of seizing oneself by the hair and removing oneself from one essence, the natural, and depositing oneself into another, alienation, which has never been otherwise than the human condition. It's not clear what sense of alienation is being upheld here, except maybe some vague sociobiological notion that insofar as humans are a species not overdetermined by environment and instinct, this constitutes a genetic alienation. Alienation, like value production in a number of similar discourses, is everywhere and thus nowhere. But even in the non-manifesto, more extended theoretical articulations, there appears this weird normativity of alienation used to mean something like mediation, in the service of striking a blow for ambitious social democratic political programs against retrograde anarchists and other radical riffraff who are not sufficiently enthusiastic about a certain undifferentiated notion of science. Two more examples. One of the Xenofeminist Manifesto's authors, Helen Hester, wrote in an interesting text about a year ago on the gendering of technology and the need to rearticulate social reproduction feminism against this. She argues for what she calls a feminist Prometheanism. She writes, quote, nascent projects such as xenofeminism, for example, are seeking to articulate a technologically minded, counter-hegemonic gender politics fit for an era of globality, complexity, and alienation, and as such, evince a commitment to the development of more systemic approaches to oppression, reminiscent of those Promethean perspectives of winning, which characterize strands of second-wave activism, end quote. Alienation is about winning, remember that. Prometheanism is encapsulated as, quote, it might, at its most general level, be characterized as a transformative, world-building, and technologically enabled emancipatory endeavor oriented towards the future, end quote. So here, alienation is a particular characteristic of this era. In contrast to the notes for the symposium, we have more alienation now, not less. And it can be repurposed as a critical distance, as a willed disidentification, you could say, and enable future-oriented emancipatory endeavors, even if it's at the cost of being chained to a rock and having a vulture nibble at your liver for all eternity. Again, it's obvious that alienation sounds more striking than mediation, but obviously what is at stake here is an emphasis on a politics of mediation against the somewhat reductive notion of a politics of immanence. And perhaps getting more philosophically involved, the emphasis is on externalization. The alienation of alienated labor is nowhere at stake in this. Meanwhile, and I've had a look, the thinking around Prometheanism that Hester is critically engaging with here doesn't really talk about alienation at all. So what we end up with here is a kind of solving of alienation, which maybe does get at the eradication of at least the subjective affect of alienation in contemporary labor that the symposium's notes describe. Xenofeminism and accelerationism, in their use of alienation, can be viewed as the critical theoretical equivalents of the current trend for microdosing with psychedelic drugs in Silicon Valley. Both are solutionist approaches, and as such, misrecognize the problem. Solutionist in the sense that more science, or our science, can solve the patriarchy. More alienation, our alienation, will solve the alienation of capitalist life and its institutions. Microdoses of LSD will expand our minds just enough for us to keep moving fast and breaking things. In a recent article on the phenomenon, Emma Stamm writes that insofar as psychedelics are being optimized to deal with mood disorders, enhance efficiency, etc., they are no different, or they're being framed as being no different to antidepressants, except the whole point of psychedelics is that they should create a window, however ephemeral, into another way of being in the world, and thus into the transformability of the world. At least that was the political horizon claimed by psychedelics in the anti-systemic movements of the 60s, for example, the other side of their more common reputation as an escapist lifestyle apparatus. In the same way, the solutionist approach to alienation is to an extent dictated by market imperatives, the imperative to foist ever new critical commodities into a high turnover academic market. And this includes the imperative to produce a relatable alienation, which we can feel good about, as well as diagnose in innumerable situations of our everyday lives. Alienation, thus, is no longer a condition of distance or passivity. It's something empowering. So this is a maneuver which can submerge some of not only the complexities and involuntarities, the structural and structuring dimensions of alienation, but also the critical insights that can be recovered from its own project, which for Hester is the important one of reading a gendered history and set of premises into the mantra of technological innovation as progress that has always accompanied capitalist social relations and is ever more ubiquitous. Given that an entire history of technology can be written purely in terms of devices and ways of organizing production developed by capital to defeat and confine the working class, free or bonded, as Marx notes, this seems like a crucial extension of social reproduction feminist critique. Likewise, there is an argument to be made, and it often has been made, that you need alienation to generate resistance, and that's why capitalist labor and social conditions are discussed as more emancipatory compared to feudal ones. This was incidentally also an argument made against wages for housework, again, when taken as a simple abstraction, the campaign, not as we know at the same time wages against housework. So the argument being that women can only become part of the revolutionary class once their labor is alienated officially by wages outside the home. Unpacking all that is, of course, a large task. But that requires all sorts of assumptions and historical arguments and dialectics that a simple revalorization of alienation as a politics adequate to a complex world doesn't really perform, because it converts the plurivalence and determinacy of alienation into a simple abstraction. And besides, alienation is winning. If there's one point that you take away from my presentation tonight, is that there's a lot of simple abstractions out there, and they're hard to avoid. But we shouldn't be making more of them deliberately. Like Douglas Hübler said, the world is full of objects, more or less interesting. I do not wish to add any more. So there are at least two ways to make alienation disappear. One is to turn it into a positive, if not positivist, concept. The other is to identify so closely with one's alienation that it is canceled out because you are doing what you love. The latter is certainly what is often attributed to artists. See, I knew I'd get back to artistic labor somehow, but just briefly. And more generally, to the becoming creative, flexible, and auto-entrepreneurializing of all work, especially under the sway of social algorithms. In my soon-to-be published book, Speculation as a Mode of Production, I spend a lot of time trying to engage this set of assumptions and arguments, and I'm suggesting that the granularity of alienation, if that's still the term that we want to stick with, given all the sticky associations I've been deriving from it over the past half hour, the granularity of alienation is alienation undergoes a kind of proliferation and expansion rather than disappearance under current social and economic and subjective conditions. And insofar as platform capitalism, the gig economy, etc., is about the extension of accumulation and commodification, as well as the weird resurgence of pre-modern master-servant relations packaged in apps, then obviously alienation accompanies that. This hypothesis, of course, entails a resistance to thinking of alienation as a psychological or psychic category chiefly, rather than as a tendency embedded at all kinds of levels of objectively, so to speak, reproduce social relations. Perhaps in counter to this, you could make the argument that no one is more psychically alienated than people who believe, i.e. choose to believe, themselves to be performing voluntarily what they're actually coerced into doing structurally. But then art isn't alienated labor, though there's a ton of alienated labor in the presentational, pedagogical, and production apparatus of art, given that it's the absolute fetish commodity. At least those are the paradoxes that are interesting to me, and certainly there's much more to say on all those points. But I can't say anything else now, because I've already gone on too long. Thank you so much. Yes. If you can't think of any now, you can always ask them later in the general thing.
Thank you, especially for addressing xenofeminism, which is a very recent, infuriating text for me. I wanted to ask about the term relatable alienation, because you presented a lot of examples. If, I don't know, it could be somehow summarized. I mean, is this an alienation which is always produced somehow dialectically, and that it's not, does not reside, does not dwell in the subject, or would you define it somewhere else in summary?
I guess with the idea of relatable alienation, it was more kind of talking about alienation becoming kind of de-dialecticized and becoming kind of domesticated, so that it becomes really a kind of way of talking about recapturing an idea of freedom or agency in this kind of, through these kinds of critical formations that I was talking about. So it's a kind of, becomes more of a one-dimensional thing that we can relate to, like we can relate to any other sort of attitude that is presented to us in commodity life. So I guess, yeah, it was really kind of more about the process of reducing it to something that is relatable and positive. That was a very basic move.
Not so basic. Thank you very much. And again, also from me, thank you very much for going back to xenofeminism.
Last time, never again.
I have a question in relation to that, because one thing I found interesting about the argument is that what you lined out with xenofeminism is that alienation is basically used as a motor of positivistic progress, that it becomes this pseudo-leftist dynamism of we have to proceed further. And you were very briefly mentioning the criticism of Federici and Swartz for the relation of capitalism and feudalism. But I was wondering, if one is, because, sorry, I don't really know how to put it. Because in a way, if one criticizes xenofeminism as structurally, as fundamentally as you just did, then one can also take this argument back historically and say, well, capitalism is not a further development from feudalism. Feudalism was a different time with different qualities. And would you say that, or would you?
Yeah, so I was kind of, again, like what I was doing a lot, maybe quite quickly, is kind of presenting theoretical objects in a sense, and saying, so a lot of people say that capitalism is progressive through that kind of argumentation. I didn't sort of make an argument with that argument, I just presented it. But I think, yeah, I said it would take a lot to unpack all those arguments. I didn't do it, but yeah, they should be unpacked. But from the perspective that you were just pointing to very shortly, but also a number of other critical perspectives, yeah. And that's why I also wanted to mention free or bonded labor as also entering into the relationship of alienation in different ways, very different ways. Everyone should read Gerstenberger. Any other questions? Comments?
On? Hello? Yeah. Could I maybe ask you to, since I asked you when we invited you, but to still elaborate a bit on the distinction between artistic labor and what is generally perceived as normal or bourgeois wage labor. So to what extent you said that there was a distinction, but you wouldn't elaborate on it. So good.
I mean, there's a lot of distinctions. I guess the one that I briefly pointed to and the one that I mostly work on, or at least that I use as a point of departure if I wasn't always working on and wasn't working on here, is just in the sense that it is practiced under different conditions. So it's not organized. That as labor, it's not organized the same way as sort of normal labor, although normal labor is increasingly not normal labor either. But I guess it's, there isn't the kind of logistical chain of operations. There's no measurement by hours or by works produced. There isn't a managerial structure. Obviously, in big studios you have that, but it's not kind of part of the concept of artistic. labor. So I guess the only difference that I was pointing to here very briefly among the many differences is, and of course you can also look at different levels of how art enters into the economy and enters into the market. And obviously it's entering in all sorts of ways, but the structure of labor is kind of in principle different because it's not performed like the generally assumed form of capitalist labor, which is managed through a chain of command and measured by wages and with an employment contract. I mean, again, these are all standards which are increasingly dissolving for a lot of forms of labor, but kind of taking those Platonic forms, maybe, that's where the difference originates. It's just a different, the mode of producing is different. That was all I was pointing to. But of course, we can ask further questions about that. Yeah? Anyone else?
I think if there's no further questions and there's still the possibilities to ask questions at the very end of this evening, we proceed with Kerstin Stackemeyer. Thank you very much, Marina.